Okay, good afternoon to all, and welcome to session 20 of year 2 of our Maximos Seminar. We are still with the Ambigua, volume 2. We are looking at pages 309 through 331 today, which is comprised of Ambigua 69, 70, 71, and an epilogue. The themes today are, unsurprisingly, play and measure and drawing near. Play and measure and drawing near. Also, intimacy and silence given phrase. Intimacy and silence given phrase. Or one's own and the simple. One's own and the simple. Let's begin where we ended last time. We were talking about how to draw near appropriately, and we even were probing this term a little bit, appropriately, what it means for something to be appropriate or to appropriate something. The question of how to draw near appropriately means really how to draw near unto one's own, that's what appropriately means here, unto one's own. That is how to draw near in a way or form that honors not only one's own, but also God's own, his own. Now, just to begin, let's turn to page 297, please. This is in the last reading, actually. It's also part of what I just put there. Page 297 at the very top. We read it out last time, but it's a very curious phrase that we should return to. Top of 297. This is within Ambiguum 67. Maximus writes, thus no thing in any way at all, no thing in any way at all that substantially possesses something considered with it. It substantially possesses something considered with it in the manifestation of its proper existence, can strictly speaking be simple. No thing in any way at all that substantially possesses something considered with it in the manifestation of its proper existence, can strictly speaking be simple. Now, we have read before and we have discussed that our being and our knowing are composite. Here Maximus is saying that even manifestation occurs within twofold being. Even manifestation occurs within twofold being. It has both noetic and an aesthetic element. It substantially possesses something considered with it. Our being is a being first with others. We're always in company. We're always in fellowship, or rejecting that. We are born into, that's our given mode of being. As Goa said last time, when we were commenting on these matters, he said, there's always a third. There's never just two. There's always a third. There's always another presence. There's always with. Now, we can be with other people, but also our own ontological condition is composite, as it were. In the readings from last time, Maximus was talking about time as the horizon of our movement, and nature as the horizon of existence. So we're at least dealing with movement in terms of time and existence in terms of nature. That's composite already. But to think of our own and the simple for a moment. We are given, as it were, forecast images of how through synergy, time and nature become, as it were, more than their own. They're transcended from within. We've talked about this in part using apophatic movements. And so we know that the conditions, the relations through which we are built also are transcended somehow. Last session, we pondered the phrase admits of. Maximus spoke of something, at the number 8, admitting of a certain meaning. And we said that admits of, we could consider that phrase that as mystically welcome the completion of particular meaning within the horizon of. So to admit of something is to allow to mystically welcome the completion of its meaning within the horizon. So for us, if our own admits of simplicity, all that we're saying is we mystically welcome the completion of our own particular meaning in what we understand, not understand, what we encounter or is revealed as simple. Now, the completion of our gift. We have talked about both apophatic movements and drawing near. I think that one could say apophatic movements is how our whole gift is completed in synergy with the emphasis on God. So our gift is completed in synergy, but the emphasis is on God with apophatic movement. Drawing near is how our gift is completed in synergy, but the emphasis, as it were, is on us. So it's not segmenting or segregating, but the emphasis. We don't make ourselves the center of apophatic movements. But both drawing near and apophatic movement are part of synergy. And so synergy involves both a letting go, part of the apophatic movement is letting go, and a drawing near, a letting go and a drawing near. But this letting go and drawing near must be, well, not to use the language of necessity, letting go and drawing near happens without intent or interest or presumption. Our letting go and our drawing near are not to be understood as part of our intention or our interest or our presumption. It's more like a calling out. Calling out. In synergy, we are present as if emptied of ourselves. We've used this phrase before, as if emptied of ourselves. We are present in synergy as if emptied of ourselves. And that means as if emptied of our familiar own. Our familiar own. If synergy can be figured as a kind of calling, a kind of calling out. This is part of what we understand as our names for God. Right? Our names for God are calling unto our own, what we sense is as our own. So our names for God call unto our own, seek to draw near what we sense as reality, but we know it in its, let's say, composite manifestation in the person of Christ. And so our names are forecast. They mark the limit of our horizon of knowledge. Naming is a calling from beyond our knowing into our own. It's not identification or delimitation. Now, we call to God out of our own. We call to God out of our own. This is in the, well, we'll read it later. But we call to God out of our own. This is the same our own that through its apophatic stance has to let go of its elements proper only to time and finite nature. So we call to God out of our own, but this our own is letting go of the elements proper only to time and nature. So we're still not sure what is our own. It's not the composite being of us. What is our own? What is of our own? I think one thing we can say with some steadiness is that whatever our own is, whatever that means, it has to involve our gift of being. And our gift of being inwardly forms our longing to draw near to God, our longing for intimacy of God. So the gift of longing might be close to our own. But our own is difficult. Our own is difficult. It's easier in a way to say thine own unto the divine, thine own. And at a certain point in the liturgy, the most intimate of communions is phrased in terms of thine own of thine own. The most intimate of offerings, the most intimate of communions. Thine own of thine own completes, as it were. It's a liturgical completion of the gift, as it were. But thine own, in the liturgy, we're speaking of the holy gifts, thine own of thine own, and they're offered unto God on behalf of all and for all. But the person we meet, who's made in the image of Christ, in the image of God, is also thine own, God's own. And so thine own of thine own, we can say in an act of liturgical reverence, we can say it about another person when we meet them. This is thine own of thine own. We can say it of any blessed being, for creation and all of its aspects are of God's own, of God's own. We are of God's own more explicit, not more explicitly, but explicitly, because our tradition teaches that God became person and image and likeness. Christ, we can say that Christ is, and we are as Christ is. Insofar as we are as Christ is. The person and image is our gift. But the likeness of God refers to the completion of one's own, completion of our gift. Right? Person and image are given. Likeness is the completion of one's own. But one is not complete alone or in isolation. One's own becomes one's own properly only in divine synergy. Only by becoming his own. One's own is complete by becoming his own or thine own. And yet we know too that God's own is emptied of itself, as it were. God empties himself of all that is beyond form and formlessness, beyond language and silence, beyond thinking and making and existing. He empties himself of that to come to us, to draw near to us, in order to correspond to our names for God, the ways in which we call out and seek to draw near. And so we're met with this strange notion, strange because it's a deep mystery, that God empties himself of his full own, as it were, in order to become our own. God empties himself of his full own in order to become our own. So that's the image of our own, the divine self-emptying. So what is most profoundly our own lies in mystery, in our blessed capacity for mutual self-transformation. This is always with others. It is an emptying or giving of oneself, of ourselves, for the sake of others. Because it is only together, this is back to the being with, it's only together, the perfection of gathering together, that we're able to partake of Christ's transforming presence, his healing transfiguration, not alone, together. And it is in the moments of inner transformation, present with others in loving relation, that our own is fullest. It's in that moment of inner transformation, present with others in loving relation, that our own is fullest. But this inner self-transformation may not be foreseen or anticipated. It happens in the encounter, in the co-responding that happens out of our attunement to the other person. And our attunement, which is another way of saying presence, our attunement to the other person depends on what Maximus calls humility and reverence. Humility and reverence. Humility meaning we're not presuming that we take natural precedence, not putting ourselves first. And reverence meaning that we're open to the godly mystery that is being completed in the other person. So we're attuned, we're present to the other person when we're open to their own gift being completed, and we're not seeking to put ourselves above them. Now, humility and reverence are over against self-love, humility, self-love, and certainty, reverence, certainty. Humility and reverence over against self-love and certainty. And yet, insofar as our thinking is still dyadic, composite, so to speak, it's hard to get rid of these counterparts or these negations. The four aspects seem to go together, provoking a struggle. We are humble against self-love. In other words, they're still part of a composite horizon of comprehension. So we need a word for letting go of what we mistakenly presume to be our own, things like certainty, self-love, letting go, thinking that they need to be there too. And at the same time, a word for drawing near to what has been revealed as the completion of our own, in God's own, as it were, God's own emptied giving of himself to us. And the word that Maximus suggests here is play. Play. Or we could say that play is delight and desire beyond one's own. It's not for one's own. And yet it is, as it were, unto one's own and for the sake of one's own. So it's beyond, and yet it's unto and for the sake of one's own, which means, because one's own is also thine own, and thine own also means thine personal own to the person in front of us. That play is unto one's own and for the sake of one's own, which means for his sake or for her sake. The measure of play then is full enjoyment, apart from certainty and presumption. Full enjoyment apart from certainty and presumption of the beautifully moving energy of a fellow creature. And one could say we draw near to the divine from within the mode of play, which is loving fellowship beyond self-interest, beyond conclusion, beyond self-love, beyond certainty. Hermeneutically speaking, this is kind of figured in the term approximation, which means drawing near, to approximate, to bring into proximity, bring into intimacy. But approximation is a word that we can use that stands in distinction to certainty. Maximus does here. But in that word, approximation means drawing near, just like appropriation means drawing unto one's own. Approximation means drawing into nearness. That's how we should understand it. All right. Now, let's do a little walkthrough. That's just by way of preamble. Let's do a little walkthrough. We're going to focus wholly on Ambiguum 71 and then a little bit on the epilogue. But let's page through each Ambigua, because they're all interesting and we can learn something from each of them. So this is Ambiguum 69 is on page 309. If you can find it or turn to it. I'll just read the Ambiguum, and then I'll offer a few thoughts that we can return to as we wish later. So Ambiguum 69 is on page 309. It's from St. Gregory's oration on Heron. Excuse me. From St. Gregory's oration on Heron the philosopher. And the fragment is complete predicates and incomplete predicates. Complete predicates and incomplete predicates. Well, the words complete and incomplete are already interesting to us because we've been using them throughout. This Ambigua is about integral meaning. Integral meaning. And Maximus begins by referring to grammarians. Grammarians. Grammar is made up of syntax and inflection. Syntax and inflection. Syntax means gathering together, right? Syntax, together arranging. And inflection is, which also can mean mood or mode, could be what we have spoken of as tonality. So what Maximus is talking here is gathering together and the tonality of it. Predication. Predication, as it were, means the completion, the sensible completion of a thing given. So anytime there's a truth, we need predication. We need to know not only the given truth, but how it is played out to completion. Or with a subject, such as John here, we need a predication. For without predication, the I, me, John, is isolated, even if with other fragments. John is concerned with is a false simplicity. All right. Then also Maximus uses the term complete thought here. Complete thoughts constitutes a complete thought. And the Greek is автοτέλη διάνοιαν. So autotelos, self-completing, self-perfecting. Dianian. That's through the nous. So it means, as it were, a complete thought, a movement that is of its own meaning and fullness. A movement that is of its own meaning and fullness. All right. A couple of notes on Ambiguum 70, which is just to the bottom there. Same page, on page 309. This is from St. Gregory's funeral oration for St. Basil. The text, and I'm reading strictly, is, in no thing, therefore, from all things, is it possible to fail to find in one such from all. In no thing, therefore, from all things, is it possible to fail to find in one such from all. Now, speaking of syntax and grammarians, can one find a kind of gathering unto in Gregory's phrasing? I tried very hard and almost, but the word such trips you up. And so Gregory's phrasing needs to be completed in another way. Here, Maximus completes it, as it were, via synergy in prayer. Maximus partakes of Gregory's thoughts and begins to complete it in his own way, let's say. Which is only interesting because it's what we all do all the time whenever we read something, but we forget perpetually, that we're completing it in our own head, and so we think it's plainly there. Meanwhile, we're projecting. Okay. And then over to Ambiguum 71. This is page 313, 313. We're, like I said, we're going to spend the majority of our time here, but just a couple of comments first. This is from St. Gregory's poems on the words. Here's Gregory. The sublime word plays in all kinds of forms, judging his world as he wishes, on this side and on that. Read again. The sublime word plays in all kinds of forms, judging his world as he wishes, on this side and on that. I think that's my favorite sentence I've read. I find it completely delightful. It's almost, it's like an ecstasis of tradition, as in a standing forth beautifully, not as in a paroxysm. Now, we know that Heraclitus and Dionysius and Gregory and Maximus and others too, Gadamer at least, but others too, Rilke. Let's focus on the theology. Heraclitus, Dionysius, Gregory, and Maximus all use the term play. But as it were, they seem to have, I'm not sure how to phrase this, but bear with me, varying degrees of sincerity in their conception of play. Some treat it almost ironically, some treat it almost purely, some treat it almost as if it's a figure through which we move in order to come to something else. So they're not saying the same thing. Oh, well, they're not repeating each other. The other thing, or one last note here about abyss and horizon. I will return to abyss. But in this ambiguum, we see that we bring our abyss to the horizon. We bring our abyss to the horizon. And that means we draw near with our own immeasurable mystery to the immeasurable mystery of the other person. And in that self-emptying encounter, where we offer thine own unto thine own, our own is most fully granted to us. But we bring our abyss to the horizon. We draw near with our own immeasurable mystery to the immeasurable mystery of the other person. And then the final, we have the epilogue. The epilogue begins on page 329 over to 331. There's no need to turn, there's no text. But in this epilogue, we have the synergetic completion of the Ambigua. Right? Maximus opens his arms and gathers anew. He appeals. He appeals to Dionysius. He appeals to the fathers who, as he put, commissioned their work. Right? In whose own reading of it lies Maximus' peace of mind. And he also has two very interesting phrases. We can return to these or not. Maximus refers to St. Gregory as God-bearing and Dionysius as godly-minded. And I thought that was very interesting, God-bearing and godly-minded. Theophoro and Theophroni, from phronesis, mind, godly, Theophronesis, from. Okay. Now let's turn to some passages. So actually we'll begin with Ambiguum 71. So on page 313, please. I'll read out a short bit and offer a few thoughts, and then we'll get Jennings to do some reading and etc. This is the beginning of it's on page 313. If you have it, find it or look at it. But it is important to be looking at the text if possible. So I'll read from the beginning of the Ambigua just over the page, about 8 lines onto 315. From St. Gregory's poems on the words, and here's Gregory. The sublime word plays in all kinds of forms, judging his world as he wishes, on this side and on that. This is Maximus. When the great David, by faith alone, spiritually thrust his intellect through the latches, as it were, of visible realities, and gazed upon intelligible realities, noetic realities, he received from the divine wisdom a certain cognitive mark of the mysteries that are accessible to human beings. Then, as it seems to me, he said, "Abyss calls to abyss at the sound of your cataracts." With these words, he may perhaps be indicating that every nous, every intellect in a state of contemplation, on account of its invisible nature and the depth and multitude of its thoughts, is like an abyss. For after it has passed through the whole orderly arrangement of visible things and finds itself in the region of intelligible, noetic realities, and when, again by faith, it transcends even the majesty of these things by means of a forceful motion, so that it comes to stand still in itself, utterly fixed and immobile, on account of its passage beyond all things. It is then that, as is fitting, it calls to the divine wisdom, which to our knowledge is really and truly an unfathomable abyss, and asks that it might be given, not, of course, the divine cataracts themselves, but their sound, which means that it asks to receive a certain cognitive mark of faith concerning the modes and principles of divine providence governing, governing the universe. Okay. Just a few thoughts there. First, calling out, abyss calls unto abyss. Out of a profound sense of our own inner mystery, we call out, we long beyond our knowledge. We call out to the ultimate divine mystery and ask that he grants us his own measure, not himself, not the abyss itself, not the cataracts themselves, but the sound, his own measure. And so here, one is moved beyond one's own measure. Just a little bit of etymology. Abyss is from a Greek word, abyssos. It means without depth. So there's no measure, there's no sounding to an abyss. Abyss is sometimes characterized in terms of a gulf or a chasm. Gulf means a deep ravine or chasm or abyss, according to the dictionary. But gulf is from the Greek word kolpos, which means gulf, our word gulf, but it also means bosom. So when we refer to the bosom of Abraham, that's what we're referring to, the gulf, right? So it's not an abyss without measure. It is somehow embracing. In a way, maybe. I don't understand, but that's what we are kind of told. Chasm is also from Greek, meaning gaping hollow. So chasm is a kind of dire word. Gulf may be almost comforting, the bosom of Abraham, the sea's bosom. And abyss means without measure, and therefore unsoundable. We cannot take its measure. One other note. On Gregory's phrasing here, so just turn to the text, please. This is on page 313. The sublime word plays in all kinds of forms, judging the world as he wishes on this side and on that side. At the end of that first line in Greek, and hyphenated over to the next line, krinas, the word krinas. Krinas, Ezra Pound writes in one of his ABC of reading, krinos is the beginning in large letters. Krinos or krinas is where we get, or the origin of the word diakrisin in Greek, which means discernment. So krinas or krino is kin in a way to our word cern, dia, krinas, discernment, Dia or dis means with or through. Cern or krinos means to separate or to choose or to sift in physical imagery. And as it were, metaphysical imagery. Cern or krinos means to set forth as elemental, to set forth as elemental, or to cleave, to cleave. Cern, discernment, cern also forms the root of the word certainty. And so certainty means to isolate from relation and to take that as the whole truth. So discernment means through our distinctions making sense. Certainty means taking one of the distinctions, removing it, and keeping it there. This double sense of cern, how it can go either into isolation and as it were, identification, or being set forth as an element to enter back into relation, is figured in the word cleave a little bit. We talked about this word cleave in our first year of the seminar, where cleave means both to separate, to observe a difference, but also to draw together, right? To bring together. And so the sublime word plays in all kinds of forms, cleaving to the world as he wishes, on this side and on that, setting forth the beautiful particularities of the world as he wishes, on this side and on that, measuring what we understand to be immeasurable in his world as he wishes. That's the beauty of it. It's not a judgment. It's not a laying down of a conclusion. It's a renewed measure at every moment. Right. That's terribly exciting. Jennings, could I get you to read a little bit, please? We'll move on to this next passage is really thorny. Bottom of 315 over to actually the bottom of 317. So Jennings, just begin with the full paragraph with the paragraph that begins towards the bottom of 315.
For the one that says, yeah.
Indeed, completely over to the bottom of page 317, since he's able to do all things, please. And we note here shifts in Maximus's, let's say, phrasing and tonality. He's being very careful, and he makes a few shifts semantically. We have to be very careful. Yeah. Pardon me, please, David. Thank you.
Okay, sure. For the one says that the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. And the other, that the sublime word plays in all kinds of forms, judging his word as he wishes on this side and on that. Each one indicates a divine possession by the privation of what among us are the greatest affirmations, and each by the negations of our realities makes a positive affirmation of divine realities. For among us, foolishness, weakness, and childish play are privations. The first of wisdom, the second of power, and the later of prudence. But when they are predicated of God, they clearly imply his surpassing excess of wisdom, power, and prudence. Thus, if something is said of us by way of privation, in the case of God, it is rightly understood as indicating possession, and vice versa. So that if something is said of us by way of possession, it must most fitting in the case of God to understand it as indicating privation through excess. For the surpassing excess of divine realities, expressed by us apophatically as privations, are but mere remote approximations to their true meaning and form. But if this is true, as indeed it seems quite likely to be, for divine things never coincide with human beings. It follows that the foolishness and weakness of God, according to the Holy Apostle Paul, and the game of God, according to Gregory, the wondrous and great teacher, signify the mystery of the divine incarnation, since in a manner beyond being, it transcends the whole order and arrangement of every nature, power, possession, and activity. And it was this very same mystery that the most divine David beheld in his intellect from afar and was instructed in by the divine Spirit. And so, as if explaining in advance the surpassing possession of God expressed by the apostle through privation, he said, crying out to the Judeans, as I distinctly recall, "Because of the multitude of your power, your enemies shall lie to you." For every man is surely God's enemy, and obviously a liar who ignorantly and impiously confines God within the law of nature, and who cannot bear to believe that God, while remaining impassibly beyond nature, essentially came to be among things subject to nature and worked things according to nature, since he is able to do all things.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great stuff. Let's walk through. There's just a handful of passages or notes here that we should make. So at the bottom of 315, and it's mainly clarifying potential depredations of translation and interpretation. The bottom of 313, he says 5 lines up, each one indicates a divine possession by the privation of what among us are the greatest affirmations. Each one indicates a divine possession by the privation of what among us are the greatest affirmations. That's the first. And this is another clause now. And each, by the negations of our realities, makes a positive affirmation of divine realities. And then he shifts again. So what's he saying here first? Possession is paired with privation. Privation belongs with possession, right? And then apophasis and cataphasis, which are the words for negation and affirmation, which don't mean possession or privation, also belong together. So he's talking about 2 different movements immediately there. One on a more familiar scale and one on a more playful scale, let's put it. That's important, first of all. Second, over the page at the top of 317, when he says, just second line in, but when they are predicated of God, they clearly imply his surpassing excess of wisdom, power, and prudence. Right? So here, now, we understand that privation and possession may be phrased in terms of excess, or overflowing, which is not a mystical image which our tradition holds. It's not admitted. So we're not at the highest images here. Down a little bit, thus if something is said of us by way of privation, and God is rightly understood as indicating possession. So one way of distinguishing between a humanity and God is that God is and has what we do not. That's all he's saying here. God is and has what we do not. And then down to this difficult. If you're looking at my text, it's heavily underlined. It's about 8 lines down. It's a sentence for the surpassing excess of divine realities. So, for the surpassing excess of divine realities, expressed by us apophatically as privations, are but remote approximations to their true meaning and form. Okay, first of all, we know that excess is the movement particular or proper to privation or possession. Or here, contradiction, not apophasis. he translates apophaseos, which means contradiction. It's the only thing it means, as apophasis or apophatically. I'm not sure why, but it's not the word. So what he's saying is, for the surpassing excess of divine realities expressed by us via contradiction as privations, and then that fits, are but remote approximations. There we have the word approximations, right? So possession or privation, contradiction, can also draw us near. We're not disdaining. We are just being careful about how we use them. All right. That's a particularly interesting way of translating those. I'm not sure why. Just down a little bit, 5 lines down. Signifying the mystery of the divine incarnation, since in a manner beyond being it transcends the whole order and arrangement of every nature, power, possession, and activity. And it was this very same mystery that the most divine David beheld in his nous from afar, and was instructed in by the divine spirit, etc. So David saw, as it were, in a vision, the incarnation beyond our ideas of abstract or concrete. Right? This is another kind of way of talking about forecasting image. And an image in Maximus is not a removal from reality. It is the form of it. Sorry, not a removal from truth. It is the form of truth we have now. So here we have, figured in the great biblical figure of David, time and nature transcending themselves, allowing a glimpse of what it means to become more thine own than one's own. And then at the very end, that God, while remaining impassibly beyond nature, essentially came to be among things subject to nature and worked things according to nature, since he is able to do all things. That is to what we try to correspond when we say from our hearts, thine own of thine own. That is the gift that we will never meet or measure up to, but it is what we seek to draw near to in ourselves, embodied in ourselves. Okay. Just one brief passage then, over to 319, please. One brief passage about method. This is just at 2 lines after the section break, another contemplation of the same. So, considering the proposed difficulty in a different manner with the help of divine grace, and then here's the phrase, by means of conjectures and not categorical assertions, by means of conjectures and not categorical assertions. For by the one we remain within due limits. Conjecture remains within due limits, but the other is impetuous. So with conjecture and with due limits, things are drawn together as one with regard to how they will complete each other. That's a healthy cleaving. But with categorical assertions and impetuosity, well, certainty beyond category, and a categorical assertion means absolute. So certainty beyond nuance or beyond category is a false simple. It's a false simple. And when we hasten after the simple, it is not only impetuous, but impertinent, inappropriate. Bear with me a little bit more in terms of etymology. So, by means of conjecture and not categorical assertions. So, conjecture here, we have played with that word in previous uses at Maximus, previous times Maximus used it, by likening it with symbol, because it means etymologically to draw together, to bring in together. Just like project means to put forward, or reject means to push away, conject, draw together. But here the translator is using it to render the word stokastikos, which means aiming. It means kind of rough aiming. And so what he's saying is, by means of aiming, and the translation is categorical assertions, but the word is apophantikos, which, despite how close it sounds to apophasis, is not. It's from phantikos. Apophantikos means statements or pronouncements with authority, right? With authority. Apophantikos. And it comes from the roots, or comes from the composite term apopheno. Pheno is the center of phenomenon, right? So it means what comes into appearance. And so apopheno means to clarify firmly what has come into appearance. To clarify firmly what has come into appearance. Pheno means to bring to light, or to reveal, to present, to set forth. And apo means of that revealing, of that setting forth, of that bringing to light. The construction of that word gives us a clue about how we've been understanding the rich term apophasis. The phasis means saying, and the apple of that saying with confidence. Okay. Michael, may I ask you to read a little bit, please? Let's move on to the next section. And it's actually just down that page on 319, towards the bottom of 319, beginning, just 4 lines up. And this is a paradox. And this is a paradox at the end of 419. Over to the end of that long full paragraph on 321 that ends, he makes no mention here whatsoever. So just the bottom of 319.
Okay, great. Thank you, by the way, for uploading these to the chat. There might be a slight interruption as I'm reading this from the chat area as I move to the next page. Okay, so starting from and this is a paradox. And this is a paradox, to behold a state of rest that is forever flowing and being carried away, and a flowing that is unmoved, which has been providentially devised by God. Pardon me. Sorry, I'm trying to find my cursor. Andrew, do you want to finish the paragraph?
Of course.
I'm struggling a little here with the.
Not to worry.
Do you want me to finish the reading of that? Andrew's been doing lots of talking, so I'm happy to. Okay.
Go ahead, Jennings. Go ahead.
So just again from the end there of 319, the sentence. It says, we'll just start again. And this is a paradox, to behold a state of rest that is forever flowing and being carried away, and a flowing that is unmoved, which has been providentially devised by God for the betterment of the things that come under his dispensation, since it has the power to make wise those who are taught by it, inspiring them to hope that they will depart from here for another place entirely, and to believe that the end of the mystery concerning this motion that affects them is that through their inclination to God, they will certainly be divinized by grace. By mean terms, I mean the plentitude of visible realities that are now around man, or within which man finds himself, while the extremes, I mean the substance of future realities that are not visible, but will without fail come to be around man. Realities that have properly and truly been created and have come into being in accordance with the ineffable and primal purpose and rationale of the divine goodness. In the same way, when the wise Ecclesiastes, with the great and clear eye of his soul, looked beyond the coming into being of visible and transitory things and beheld, as it were, the vision of what had been truly created and brought into being, he said, excuse me, what is this that has been brought into being? Is it the same as that which will come into being? And what is this that has been created? It is the same as that which will be created. He clearly had in his mind the first things and the last things, inasmuch as they are the same things and truly exist. But of the things in the middle, which pass away, he makes no mention here whatsoever. Continue, or we're done there?
No, that's perfect. Pardon me. Thank you, David.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Okay.
Beautiful. Excuse me. Okay, just a few thoughts. This we can, I mean, we need to return to these passages, but just a few entryway thoughts for here. He begins with a paradox, and this is a paradox. Paradox means two things are to be held at once, or even as one. And we've seen plenty of this in our reading so far, where we are to consider something as one. Paradox is also a different viewpoint and a different horizon than, let's say, thing and opposite at war, or something in its negation, or even something in its response. There's a drawing together or a fusion of categories in a paradox, which means they're mutual transformation. They're mutual. So the coming together in a paradox means mutual transformation of established ways of knowing. Then we'll come back to, well, flow here. This is the paradox: to behold a state of rest that is forever flowing and being carried away, and a flowing that is unmoved. Flow here seems to be something key, the horizon of movement and rest, maybe. Flow means from one's own and unto one's own, unto his own, but his own is our own. So it's one's own unto one's own, or thine own unto thine own, his own unto his own. It's the same movement. Flow here might be a way of figuring what we have tried to understand as apophasis. I'm not sure, but maybe. Then on the next page, he has, I'm not going to delve into them, but just to note, we have forecast images, images of some kind of truth beyond horizons of movement and being, time and nature. Maximus speaks about the end of the mystery concerning this motion, the end of the mystery concerning this motion. That's a forecast image. He talks about the substance of future realities, gathering from St. Paul, substance of future realities. That is a forecast image. Nothing we know of substance will be recognizable. And then he also relates the great vision of Ecclesiastes. I like that, with the great and clear eye of his soul. It's really lovely. And here we have the Ecclesiastes vision and participation beyond horizons of time and nature. So this transcending, this unto thine own, is not historically confined, certainly not historically confined. It's probably not geographically confined either. Okay, you can come back to that. one last passage in Ambiguum 71. This is on page 325. Please turn to page 325. And if well, it's about five lines down from the top of 325. Do follow along if you can. I'll read it out. Thus, perhaps, the teacher is saying that God, who is superior to all, by leading us through the nature of visible creations, as if it were a kind of story, seeks to amaze or attract our attention by the sight and knowledge of these things, as if we were no different than children. After which, he directs us to the contemplation of the more spiritual principles within these things, and finally leads us by way of theology up to the more mystical knowledge of himself, so far as this is possible. A knowledge which in the initial stages is purified from all varied appearances and compounds, whether of form or quality or shape or quantity, found in either numerical multiplicity or bodily mass, and so on to the end of contemplation. Remember paradox? And this is called playing by the God-bearing Gregory, and beguiling and going out of himself by the godly-minded Dionysius. There we have God-bearing and godly-minded. So, some thoughts here. Or perhaps, Maximus keeps dancing with us. He's always dancing with us. He's offering us his hand again and again and again. Here, let's dance this way. Let's dance this way. Or perhaps this. Look here too. Then he says, leading us through the nature of visible creations as if it were a kind of story. As if. So Maximus draws us into the aesthetic realm here. He elaborates on the gift in our terms, thus completing it in the moment. As if it were a kind of story. Is he denigrating story here? Of course not. Of course not. Yet he's saying even story doesn't come close to identifying the gift. And although our notion of story is beautiful, one of the most beautiful we have, it's not we don't turn it into an idol of God. We must move apophatically beyond it. Here we have to play figured as a mode of intimacy, of being drawn near. And through all of these delightful, blessed things, varied appearances in compound, form and quality and shape, bodily mass, numerical multiplicity, through all of these delightful, blessed things, one is drawn near without contempt for them, to the person we face, which is Christ for us. And we are utterly present to each element of the world, each person we face, for the sake of the glory of its ultimate maker, because it is thine own. And being with others for the sake of, it gives us our movement of self-emptying and inner transformation. We are utterly present for the sake of thine own. And that for the sake of thine own is our moment of emptying and inner transformation. Okay, just a couple of thoughts on that playful passage there. Okay, we're nearing the end here. I want to turn to the epilogue now. I'm going to offer just a few thoughts and then ask David Go to read it out, please. And we'll begin our conversation following that. So the epilogue begins on page 329 and it's over to 331. Maximus phrases it as a response. He says it's his response. And so we know, or we understand that the work belongs in intimate fellowship. It's a response. It's for someone, a voice. Maximus knows who asked him. That's one form of response. It's also Maximus himself co-responding to the great, great gift he has received. He is co-responding to it. He's completing it. He's not offering a truth of his own mind, but a truth of his own understood as thine own, as God's own, a truth of tradition vitally embraced. So that's in his response. He also says he yields obediently, yielding obediently. Maximus is yielding obediently in his response. And that means he is, as it were, naturally synergetic, in that his thinking is being drawn forth from his own, but apart from his will or self-interest or conclusion. It's being drawn forth from him. And so obedience, we talked about this before, and we will return to this next year, I'm sure. Obedience, like play, lies beyond questions of freedom, questions of necessity, and questions of certainty. And yet obedience has a more involved relation to our sense of authority. Authority is going to be a major focus for us. Now, he's responding out of obedience. This means that the completion of his work lies beyond his own self, where his own draws together intimately with another's own or with God's own. The completion of his work lies beyond his own self. For himself, his work is completed in the holy company of his brother monks, his fellow strugglers for Christ. For us, our comprehension, however slight, of Maximus's work becomes complete in us too, insofar as we partake wholeheartedly of how he phrases, how he articulates the divine truth of our tradition. This is my last note. So how he phrases things, how he brings the light of Christ to bear on this or that, how we sense the deep joy out of which he composes his work in humility and reverence, how he brings the light of Christ to bear. This question of how is a question of ethos or character almost. So if Maximus is being, if his self and his work, his being and his making are one, and he has profound integrity and sincerity, I think. If his being and his making are one, then insofar as he phrases truth, as he articulates truth, it is the light of Christ flowing in and through him synergetically that draws him near. So it's his being, and his being is synergetic. So it's the light of Christ in him that draws us near. Near to Maximus's own, to Maximus himself, but also near to Christ's own. Christ's own. For the horizon of encounter is established. Maximus ends where Christ begins, that we love one another. David, if you wouldn't mind, please, let's turn to the epilogue now and read through it carefully. And then we'll just open it, we'll walk right in, following your reading, David. Page 329 over to 331.
These then, to the best of my abilities, are my responses to those passages in the most divine orations of Gregory, our great Father and Teacher, that you, most blessed ones, found perplexing and urged me to address. Yielding obediently to your wishes, as was only right, I have spoken conjecturally and not by way of assertion. For my intellect is hardly capable of scaling the heights of the great and lofty mind of our godly minded teacher, since it continues to be wounded, and voluntarily at that, by the arrows of the passions, and taking greater delight in being scarred by the vices that it does in being cleansed by the grace of the virtues, because its long association with evil has made it a habitual lover of sin. And if anything that I have said should appear to you to have any value for the purpose at hand, and not to have fallen completely short of the truth, then the thanks are due to God, who illumined my stunted intellect, a miracle indeed, which creeps along low to the ground, and who granted me the commensurate power of expression, so that I might express the proper measure of my thoughts. Thanks are also due to you, who commissioned this work, and whose prayers assisted in bringing the whole to completion. If, however, these things are either incorrect or imperfect, and I have wandered from the truth either wholly or partially, here I beseech you with the words of the great theologian Dionysius. May it be of your loving kindness to correct him who unwillingly is ignorant, and to impart a word to him who wishes to learn, and to vouchsafe assistance to him who has not power in himself, and to heal him who not willingly is sick. Thus, together with all your other blessings, or rather before them all, you will preside over a precious offering, more vulnerable, more venerable than every sacrifice, namely loving kindness to God, who in heaven and on earth is glorified by all creation, and who asks of us but a single sacrifice, that we love one another.
Amen. David, would you like to open this up for us? Let's begin to walk into some prayers.
Well, this is sort of extraneous a bit, but it's so striking to me that in the whole work, I mean, it's a kind of crescendo with this epilogue, but it's striking to me that in his whole work, he is he's preoccupied with inviting the reader to think about how these matters are at play in their spiritual life, are at play in their relationships. And this is so different from the way in which, the way in which I read theology for 20 years, where the concern was to get at the truth, to make a case, to make an argument, to get it right. So it seems to me, the whole tone of it is so different in that it's not about making a case for something. It's not about kind of apology. It's not even really about theological ideas. He's very much talking to the monks that he knows, and the focus is on what do these matters have to say to us about the way in which our mind and our heart lead us out of communion, away from each other, or the ways in which we are called to abide with each other. So it's so striking to me how distinct it is in that way. But I'd be really interested in, David, you and I sort of grew up in similar kinds of worlds,
Mm-hmm.
with a love of theology and a love of the church. And we both have never lost that. That's been one of the gifts we got from our fathers. And I mean, I'm not saying anything negative about that. It's just so striking that, in a sense, the purpose of this strikes me as very much in a sense, I'm not sure this is the right word to use, but it's the word that you and I are familiar with. The purpose of this is so profoundly pastoral.
Yeah.
How does it strike you?
Well, I think that, it's interesting because it is different than what, the Apologia or the Ambigua is different than the first volume, where it was more theologically categorized. He was dealing with an issue and talked about it. Here, I think it's much broader, and that beautiful line that he had, where he said, by means of conjectures and not categorical assertions, for by the one we remain within due limits and the other is impetuous. I think that just sort of paints what he's been doing the whole way through. And I know that at least I on times would kind of like to put the thumbtack in and put it up on the wall and get a clear definition or understand it. And he's just not willing to do that for my benefit. He wants me to, wallow in it, to marinate in it, and knowing that that's a bit better for you than thinking you have a certainty. It was, I've loved this, Andrew. A couple of things that it struck me, the word cern, where you were talking about, to separate, to sift, to distinguish, that sort of stuff. You're talking about the etymology of that. And I found it interesting. I hadn't realized that was the etymology, but when I think of the what's it, the Council European for the Research of Nuclear, whatever the French, the
Yeah,
CERN,
it's CERN. Yeah.
where you're whipping a particle around, and that's exactly what you're trying to do, is to separate it, to distinguish it, to actually get that going. There was someone there who knew their Latin when they called it the CERN accelerator, and that's there's a mystery in that as well. So it isn't a distinction or by way of a reductionism. So I, even though perhaps there is a separateness, it isn't done without the entirety in contemplation. So anyway, I found that really interesting and a fun way to be able to play with that. Two things I would ask, and I think paradox is probably going to answer the question in both instances. But you started off by saying one of the key things here was drawing near. And yet by the end of it, I think what we heard was being drawn near. That is, we're not the authors of drawing near. It's perhaps a centrifugal force, like an accelerator, where we are being brought together, not so much that we are drawing near to something. That's just one, and I know it's a both and that's part of the paradox that is associated with that. The other paradox that I thought was, you had said, I think it was on the top of 317, God is and has what we are not, and implicitly I think you meant and have not. Yeah, at the bottom of 317, talking about the incarnation, he explicitly warns us about anybody who forgets that God is and has what we are and have. That's part of the incarnation, of being fully human. So we've got both the God is and has what we are not and have not. But the incarnation says God is and has what we are and have. And both, and on the same page, he's making that point. And speaking not ill, but a warning to those who it is. For every man is surely God's enemy and obviously a liar, who ignorantly and impiously confines God within the law of nature, and who cannot bear to believe that God, while remaining impassibly beyond nature, essentially came to be among things subject to nature. I just think, again, paradox, but boy, that's just so rich. You drew me up short the last time I was on. It wasn't on the last time, but you drew me up short when I was talking about rest. As yet Gregory was talking about this motion as something that we wanted. And I just noted that when rest is at, and you pointed out, well, rest isn't just lack of motion. And I think that that's what Maximus has at his best, has been constantly telling us, don't put thumbtacks in this or this. There's something far richer and deeper, ineffable. We won't understand it, but the only way you're going to get closer to it is if you don't try to nail it down, but just keep in relationship with it and just keep going. So in that sense, it's kind of hard to say goodbye to Ambigua, which sounds like, I don't know my Greek. I guess the Ambigua means I got a hunch. Sounds like the way that he wrote that epilogue, which was just beautiful.
Just to respond to a couple, ambigua means difficulty. That's how it's, but ambiguous reminds us of paradox, where we think, well, it could be, and scandal, just like scandal doesn't mean a kind of public impropriety that people gasp about, but something over which people stumble. The gospel is, if you stumble over it, it's not scandalous.
Well, exactly.
So you're right. To clarify that the second comment, or the second thing you said, that was my way of trying to gloss. I did say one way of distinguishing human and God is he is and has what we do not and are not. And that was a way to try to understand why Maximus at the beginning of top of 317. So it's not my idea, it's my way of trying to figure him, where he says, if something is said of us by way of privation, it in the case of God is rightly understood as possession. And that either or, that black and white, it doesn't work very well. And that's why I got into the language a little bit, because that's not what apophasis is. And when the translator used apophatic here for another word, he's confusing what exactly you're pointing to. That Maximus does talk on this level of is and is not, or has not. Theoretically, within the embodied incarnation of Christ, everything is as one, as we know. But it's a kind of blunt way of reminding us to be extraordinarily careful what we think is related or links. But you're right, of course, it would be wrong and scandalous to say that we are not as Christ is, because that's the whole truth. Of course, I was trying to make sense of privation and possession.
Yeah, and I hope I wasn't heard as criticizing. I was pointing out what he himself was doing. Yeah, at the top and the bottom of the page. Yeah,
it's a very good point. Yeah. And I like that. I like your attention to detail, because Maximus, the details of each line matters, not just the overall impression of a page.
Yeah.
To your other notes, which I love, drawing near. Part of the reason it took a long time to try to craft that image, because it does have to be not self-generated, and it does have to be not one way. But the twofoldedness you point to is intended in that term, drawing near. And I think that we've referred to it even in these terms in the past. But drawing near, it is, I draw near to you, but it's also like as to draw from a well. I'm drawing, something's being drawn near, or a chimney draws smoke. So that word draw is not merely subjective or active or passive. It's kind of in between. But you're exactly right. Drawing near, if we think it means my activity towards God, we didn't really talk about that, because that's almost the first thing that we have to let go. It strikes me that that's part of what, just to hand it over, what you and Go are talking about here. We have to let go of trying to, well, this is certainly what is meant by this, and this is certainly, we have to let go of that. We are being drawn near through these things. We're not trying to identify with those statements themselves.
I'll just
go on.
Remind you of it was that other little text in Maximus in the Philokalia, where he says that God does everything for us. What is ours is the good disposition of our will. So I appreciate, David, that you raised that. God does all the work. If we have a good disposition of our will, we sweat. We're drawn near. Yeah. Or to quote Wesley, who I know you love, and that, at least I think it's Wesley, that lovely Protestant hymn, abide with me.
Me, yeah.
The whole notion of abiding. And that, of course, is a hymn to oneself. It's saying, may I recognize that God abides with me. Yeah. On this,
actually, that isn't Wesley, by the way, but yeah, it's a beautiful hymn. Yeah.
On this matter of paradox, I couldn't help but remember a little reflection on this by Kazantzakis. I have no memory where it is, but where he talks about, I think it's in his reflection on what he calls the Cretan glance, the way in which he sees Crete as positioned between Europe and Asia, and he's making a lot out of that. But he talks about the ancient Minoan bullfight, And of course, the horns of the bull are called paradox. And in that ancient Minoan form, unlike what the Spanish do, because after all, they're Catholic, so they always want to spill blood. But the ancient Minoans want to play. So the bullfight is really, it's really a kind of ritual of acrobatics, where you enter into your relationship to the bull and you dance with the bull. And sometimes that means touching the bull's paradoxes and tumbling over the bull and rising again to do it again. But the bull in this sense is also in a sense the encounter with the abyss. And it is also a bit of a playing with death.
Most literally.
Literally, yeah. In any case, I have to look that up because I haven't read it in years, but it was such a striking image around paradox.
Yeah, seems that the Maximus is alerting us to paradox. Speaking of Greek, I can't but help but to think that the kind of Heraclitean paradox that he presents us with really provides a kind of thread out of this deathly labyrinth that has been constructed, insofar as the hopefully there might be some pushback on my characterization, but every tradition has deathly aspects. I'm just going to sort of assert that and see what kind of response I generate. And it seems to me that Maximus, who has an exegetical disposition toward the tradition, nonetheless kind of understates his ability to draw upon the most salutary aspects of the tradition, buying into the terminology and concepts that have been largely inherited, like the Greek tradition at the same time, from Platonism and Neoplatonic thought. And so I'm just going to make one kind of stab here, what I take Maximus to be showing us. I think the most deathly aspect of theology is when it starts to try to picture that which is divine and that which the process of deification might be drawing us toward, but when it doesn't resist the temptation to try to characterize the divine. And I think the temptation sometimes is flirted with when the logos, or that which the logos, the word logos is an approximation of, is characterized as static and unchanging. And I think by emphasizing the simplicity of the logos, I think that is the kind of thread that takes us through and lets us resist the notion of a kind of Platonic abstraction, because I think that's what a kind of unstated, kind of suppressed view that works itself from the Greeks into the tradition, insofar as anyone in the tradition theologically tries to describe the absolute as static and changeless. And so I was really struck by the paradox of characterizing in that passage, which I sort of stumbled over since I was reading it in the chat function. But I wrote down the notes. The idea of a state of rest that is forever flowing and being carried away. I think this really does, in a way, at the risk of trying to unlock a paradox, it really does kind of allow us to see the paradox as letting us understand what simplicity means. Because I think this will be a stumbling block for a lot of people outside of the tradition. Simplicity seems to be possible if you're talking about that which is just infinitely rich. But if that which is infinitely rich is, throwing us back to earlier discussions, horizontal without horizons, that is radically indeterminate in a sense. If it's simple and yet ever flowing, it can be characterized as unchanging, but only if we understand that which is unchanging as not static. Now, I seem to be contradicting myself, but hopefully, I think Maximus so strikingly indulges in this language, but then it's always qualifying his point. And so seems to me metaphysically very far removed from, and I might be doing an injustice to Plato, and I should probably be careful there, but the reception of Plato, providing us with forms that are changeless and perfect, I think does an injustice to the idea of the logos, which is full of life and rich and enriching constantly. And insofar as we're drawing close to it, we're in anything but a point of we're never, insofar as we try to, as David suggests, to pin our idea to the wall through categorical assertions. We're always not thereby in a state of play, but trying to achieve a certainty. And I'll just close with this. I admire a scientific grasp of reality, obviously. But as Quine, who is a fairly formidable logician, who also esteems the empirical above all else and perhaps nothing else, says that it rests on a notion of identity. That which exists has to be identifiable. And in science, we have the only mechanism, the only mode outside of the static and dead identification of pure mathematics, by which we can identify things with staggering levels of precision that aren't available with the more common sense and intuitive means of grasping identity. But it's a trap, because we can only do that by isolating that which we're measuring. Whereas I think what Maximus is opening us up to is that which is non-isolatable, that which is harmonious and connects everything holistically, is simple in that sense. And it's ever flowing, and it's the only way we can make sense of simplicity that doesn't try to trap us into a kind of abstract notion of stasis. That's a bit of a spiel, but that's my interpretation of Maximus's wonderfully humble exegetical interpretation of a tradition, and leading us through potential dead ends in theology into this wondrously apophatic vision that is kind of Heraclitean, but in a way that mates the logos far more explicitly than even I think Heraclitus, or the aphorisms that we attribute to Heraclitus, managed to do. I was sincere about inviting some pushback. Because this was kind of probably not a terribly well qualified little.
I don't think it warrants pushback. The only thing I think is that Maximus is gracious enough to give us, through his example of talking about what it's like to play with children, and as they grow up, you have different conversations. He's not criticizing, baby talk. And I think spiritually, where you start off is with baby talk. So you do speak of never changing, always constant, et cetera. And that's amazingly true for, in baby talk. And so it's a both and, I think. I mean, your point is absolutely right, but it wouldn't probably be right with, talking to an infant about it, so I'm not saying I'm now this mature male. I'm just saying, I think that Maximus would say that we have to even give ourselves grace in that discussion.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I actually do feel kind of like an infant, because even though I was disparaging these abstract terms, I'm stuck on something that there's certain words, like the word true and the word not, for example.
Yeah.
In other words, like a few basic words, and I do kind of hold on to those as things that if we dispense with the very possibility of meaning and everything. And so the challenge for me is to understand, well, they can't work in isolation. And as soon as we try to integrate them, we realize that even these kind of basic logical terms, if I can describe it that way, are not sufficient, that they're indispensable, but they're somehow integrated. And here I'm just kind of sort of babbling and running out of any kind of ability to say very much. And I know someone, a retired professor, Ray Jennings, who is working on a great book right now, and it's going to be a radically Heraclitean book. And he introduced this wonderful concept that reality is the totality of change, and it's even change in the forms of change. So this is what is radically Heraclitean and arguably a kind of relativistic view, as you could imagine. I remember throwing at him, and I the thought, and it sort of held him up at the time, but it was just a kind of a conversation in a pub. Well, Heraclitus believed in the logos. How does the logos reckon into this radically Heraclitean view? And I hope when he publishes this, if he does in the next year or so, that he'll address that issue. But it seems to me that Maximus has been addressing it throughout. But certainly at the end, when he does introduce this notion of change, it's a way of characterizing the logos, not of characterizing just the flux of things. It's something more, something integrated, which we stumble over when we try to talk about it. So we're all children as we approach Maximus' paradox, as it were.
Yeah,
as if children. Let me, Michael. That was. I need to think a long while about what you said. That was really, really profoundly beautiful. But let me see if I can offer a thought that might get us focus on something you said. sort of. These words which you love, I love some words too. And we know you love them. You keep bringing them up. It's palpable. It's beautiful. Just like my own vows and David's own vows and so on. If we think of in that passage on 325, when Maximus says, as if in a story, as if it were a kind of story, right? And we know that he's not denigrating story. I don't even think he's denigrating children. He often speaks as childhood in his work as, let's say, a period of transition. You know, once you're a child, now. But I think that is as it were, a fault of time, where we think that because the adult succeeds the child, that somehow it is a more perfect being or some human being. Now we're more perfect than a child. And as soon as we say it like that, it sounds very strange. Christ, says, be like children, invites the little ones under him. The reason I'm saying this is I don't, and this is why I asked at the beginning, Heraclitus, Gregory, Dionysius, Maximus, how, as it were, sincere are they in their concept of play? If play is a dismissive figuration for them, we're playing for a while and then we mature. We become serious. We start pinning stuff on the wall. That seems to me wrong-headed. I didn't make this explicit earlier. I mean, but we're there anyways. But if play is really delight beyond oneself, delight and desire and participation and joy beyond oneself, why would we ever disdain what brings us to that itself? Just like, why would we ever disdain this world of beautiful form and image in people? We're not disdaining it for somewhere better. No, that's awful. This is the world of Christ's incarnation. This is why we can't speak in terms of possession and privation. And this is why we can't speak in terms of positive and negation when we're talking epistemologically about our being and our knowledge of God. It has to be apophatically. And as you put it beautifully, as you phrase it beautifully, that apophatic stance is the urge not to try to pin down and then separate and isolate. And no, it's full enjoyment, but not even a resting with, full enjoyment with, through, and beyond, moving, just like in a game. You don't focus on the ball in the game. It's part of the game, but it's not. It's absolutely important. You just don't disdain it. That's not the point. And so what do we make of this idea of play? Does play mean, is there condescension in the word play? I don't think so at all. But maybe I'm wrong. Does play point to, as it were, infancy from which we move on? Now, of course, all of our terms are, as you also said, Michael, wholly inadequate to what it is. But we're not talking about adequacy or non-adequacy. We're talking about approximation, drawing near. We don't have to reject anything in that drawing near. It's part of what I think I hear David Goy, you saying at the beginning too, where it's not discernment in order to bless and curse. It's not like that. It's gathering, constantly gathering, without any fear of what it's all beautiful. This phrase, that snippet, that immense, thing that takes 100 pages to elaborate, the thing that takes 5 lines to elaborate. It's all blessed. It's all worth our attention. So pardon me, a little bit, but how do we understand play then? I mean, as an epistemological measure, we can understand it. As an ontological measure, we can understand it. We begin to get into categories, but then maybe we have to think of a paradoxical notion beyond categories. But how have each of you sensed that or figured it out? I'm very interested. Play. What do they mean by that?
Well, I think one thing is that he's not using it as a noun, he's using it as a verb. That the word plays in many forms. We play Mozart, so I don't think it immediately lends itself to a childless pursuit only. There's all sorts of things we do with play as a verb at the very, highest elements of what gives us meaning. So I don't
Maximus's
see-
imagery is with children. That's why I bring it up. He does use the image of childhood.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, I just think that we use that word, or we culturally we don't limit it to just children. We use that verb for meaning a lot of different things that we do.
It seems to me that children are more naturally, at least if they're in kind of optimal nurturing circumstances, drawn to the intrinsic delight of things and intrinsic form of creativity that would be kind of obscene to measure by some kind of mimetic completeness or anything like that. And as we get older, it's even when we're doing things which are supposed to be done for the sheer delight of doing them, sheer contemplation, it becomes a form of labor and a form of status and what have you. And so there's a kind of utilitarian value that sneaks in, and maybe a kind of theology that was more play oriented would be more attractive in a sense, and less prone to certain problems. Anyway, I'll just say so play seems to be related to the intrinsic as opposed to a more utilitarian forms of activity.
And it's intrinsic. That's what's already been given. That's the gift. That's what's there already. Yeah, that's really beautiful.
It arises and we're called into it, and we don't realize we're doing it. It's like it happens in a way.
Children are better at this. I mean, and it takes a long time. There is a kind of maybe a sprezzatura about someone who does some kind of high level activity with ease and naturalness, and that's commendable. They've gotten beyond the kind of learning stage, and it's become a second nature, and that's beautiful too. But even other creatures, when they also play, and it's there might be some, one could reductively think, okay, there's some kind of evolutionary value. They're predational creatures or creatures that have to exhibit certain activities which will be useful, but that's a really kind of narrow utilitarian driven way of looking at such things. There is a kind of natural beauty in play that can't be reduced to its use value. And of course, if everything reduces to use, then there is no value. That's the thing about utilitarian value. It doesn't take you anywhere.
Yeah.
May I offer another question that I'm very curious about? And Goa, I want to look at you first, but not exclusively at all, mainly because you read it. Can we think a little bit about the epilogue for a moment? Not in detail, as it were, but in the gesture of it. My question is, what is Maximus conveying about tradition in this epilogue? And this is the reason. So a sidestep at the end of a work isn't unprecedented. I mean, obviously. A sidestep, or I'm using a kind of physical movement to them. A sidestep can be disingenuous, or it can be honest. It can be a kind of sign of certainty or arrogance, or it could be humility. Maximus could appeal to Dionysius and those who commission the work at the end in the sense of, so look, these people asked me, I said what they wanted to say. Obviously, it's right. You know, they confirm it. Even Dionysius confirms it. He's with them. That is so crude that I don't even like to utter those phrases. But that's clearly not in his voice. But he cedes his place, CEDES, as it were, at the end. He doesn't want his voice to be the last one, but not out of something spurious, it seems to me. What do each of you, beginning with Goa or ending with Goa or whomever, it doesn't matter. What do each of you think what do we see Maximus enacting, bringing about here by this way of concluding his drawing to a close, his vast work, which we have been impressed by, deeply impressed by.
Well, he's insisting on a relationship with the reader that I wouldn't normally take on. After all of this, he says, "But hey, what are you thinking?" May it be of your loving kindness to correct him who unwillingly is ignorant, and to impart a word to him who wishes to learn, and to vouchsafe assistance to him who has not power in himself, and to heal him who not willingly is sick. He's saying, if you don't take it as a posture, a rhetorical posture, he's actually, after all of this, he says, okay, well, that's what I conjectured. What do you think? And that's an honoring of the reader that is that's pretty amazing after you've gone and written what he's just written.
And isn't it interesting that he's doing that, David? But he's also doing it having said, "You've asked. I think
Gave you what I could.
I think I've done my best. It's modest.
Yeah.
If anything is good in it, it has to do with the play of God.
Yeah.
And the play in your mind as you read this, and your prayers that have drawn it forth within me." So in a sense, he's saying, he's pointing to how this as well, which to us can appear like an intellectual feat, but it isn't. It's a being called forth, and it's a response. And so its meaning is in the play, coming out of him, who he is, in his gifts and limitations, who he's writing to, and his knowledge of them, and where they are in it, and the mystery of God, which is at play in it. So, and for that very reason, he ends up where you pointed, which is, I don't know, but here it is. And whatever is meaningful in it,
yeah,
I'm grateful for.
I don't know how one takes that position as a Christian.
Yeah.
Without an ultimate sense of ultimate reconciliation. Because certainly in the Protestant tradition, there's a lot of anxiety that one soul would be lost to God. And so we want to get out there. We want to like get them from that, 49% to 51%. But more nuanced than that is constantly, the evangelical spirit, because we love you enough that we don't want to leave you where you are. You need to understand the truth, and we have to And it's much more, I think, to put the best gloss on it, not a power play, but it is an anxiousness that this is so important that if you don't get this right, you could have eternal hell.
That's the difference, I think, between thinking this is about knowing something as opposed to where I think he's coming from and this tradition is coming from, which is about a way of being.
Yeah.
And a form of presence, about a stance and a tone, which recognizes that it isn't in your court. It's an unfolding.
Yeah. I think that's right, because it seems to me that at the end, Maximus is really just articulating something that he's shown throughout the Ambigua, that he's receptive to something that is extraordinary that's going on, and he seems to be not like a. And I want to be careful here. I certainly wouldn't disparage, even the crudest street preacher, like the one that might exist in Times Square or in front of on Bloor Street in Toronto or Davie Street in Vancouver, who radically try, almost engage in a kind of confrontational exhortation,
yeah,
whereby he's trying to encourage people, but it's not terribly encouraging. And Maximus, I think, in the most I don't think it is really just just a rhetorical stance. I think there's a deep humility. It's displaying his receptivity, and what he's encouraging is a kind of receptiveness in his audience. And one could imagine the monks reading this like any of us, and being enlivened in a very wholesome way. It's also, of course, terribly poignant, because the contrast is that his own reception was brutally cruel at the very end. That's a horrifically ironic contrast that we can't help but to have in the back of our mind. And of course, contrast with his exhortation to love, because to love even your enemy is, it's not to pander to your enemy, but it's to encourage your enemy to be more receptive. And we're all, of course, some enemies in need of the charitable form of encouragement.
And then that last line, the loving kindness to God, who in heaven and on earth is glorified in all creation. Like
by all creation. Yeah.
It's such a beautiful, it's the echo of the Psalms, which he would have chanted every day.
Yeah.
And how we're asked for only a single sacrifice. That is, we're asked to only make one thing sacred. Only one thing sacred. And that is that we love one another. Nothing else is sacred. Everything else is secondary. Doesn't mean it's unimportant, but it's secondary. It's not the point.
Amen.
Good.